Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sue Fasciani. I'm with Tiger Home and Building Inspections, and I'm here with Kara Golden. She is Director of Marketing, and she will be chiming in today and handling the chats. So when you have questions, you can go ahead and chat those in, and we'll see how everything goes as far as time for questions at the end. If we need to open it up, we can, but we want to keep on time for understanding radon properties, testing and remediation methods. So welcome everybody. If you were here last week, thank you so much, and glad you're back again today. Bill Work is our presenter today. Bill is our general manager, and he is also our radon specialist. He's been licensed home inspector since 1997. Bill holds a supervisory pest control license, wood destroying insect license, and is a member of the American Society of Home Inspectors. You might hear it as ASHI. And also nationally certified for radon testing. So he is very well versed in radon and very knowledgeable. So, get your questions ready to ask him. This is the time to do it. Bill's been involved with residential construction and a general contractor and owner property manager for years before he came to Tiger, and has many inspections under his belt. So like I said, he's very experienced. Today, I just want to tell you a couple things about Tiger Group. We are a family-owned company since 1992. So yep, it's 30 years this year. We perform commercial and residential inspections throughout the state of Connecticut, and we also border New York, Mass, and Rhode Island. And we do inspect 7 days a week. We do that because we know you guys are out there 7 days a week. So we have our office open, as well as, our inspectors are out there. And our turnaround time for our reports is 24 hours. So do keep that in mind. So your clients know that they can get that report very quickly. We have a certified staff that sets up our electronic monitors for radon testing. They also do water quality and quantity, and we have mold assessments and testing. So please keep all that information in mind, as well as if you ever need an inspector for a specialty such as 203K HUD, antique homes, commercial, I mentioned we do, equestrian and more. Kara and I would be happy to help you with that, or our office staff is really good too about helping direct you in the right, area for your clients to set you up with the right inspector. Next, I just want to share with you, Tiger is celebrating, like I mentioned, 30 years as a family-owned business. We are very, very proud of that. So we're offering right now a $30 savings on a home inspection and $30 savings on a radon air test. So, write that promotion code down, Tiger 30. And this does say valid until March 31st, but we might even extend it into April. So keep that on your radar. And you can also go to Tiger Inspect to look for other promotions we have. At this time, I'm going to turn it over to Bill. He's just going to touch on COVID real quick and then talk about radon.
Thanks, Sue. Good afternoon, everyone. Pleasure to be here. It's a great day out. And as Sue had mentioned, we're going to talk a little bit about radon today. Please feel free to use the chat feature as we're going along if questions come to mind. We may touch on those things as we go through, but if we don't, we'll certainly get to all of your questions on there. Just as we continue to work in a pandemic environment, which we all are hoping, fingers crossed, that this is ending soon. We are mindful of that, and we do have access to all of the PPE needs for our staff, and certainly they will be mindful of what people's concerns may be in houses. Our basic protocol is to ask and comply. So if clients or agents or homeowners would prefer that we wear masks in-house, we will do that. If it's not a concern, then we will adjust ourselves accordingly. And obviously, we will continue to practice general social distancing. Okay. All right. So let's go ahead and we'll move on with radon. So I don't know what the skill sets of all the individuals are that are on the call today. They're probably varied. They usually are. And certainly if there's something that that isn't clear that we're talking about, there's no harm in asking a question. Happy to back up and make clarifying points as needed. So radon, is a gas, and we need to be mindful of whether or not that's something that's present in our houses. One of the things that we are always thoughtful of is what your needs are. As realtors, your clients have an expectation that you will understand the real estate process, and of course radon as it relates to home purchases and sales comes into that category. So hence the conversation, and we want to make you as experienced as you want to be in this conversation. So if you're not aware of it already, there is a Radon National Action Month, which is in January. We've been participating in this program for, probably the better part of close to 15 years at this point. And they vary the message from time to time. What you're seeing here is one of the more recent iterations of the program, which is a elementary school campaign for posters. These are posters, examples of posters that were made by, I think, 5th or 6th grade children, which are fantastic. And the point is that trying to get to everybody with this message about the concerns for radon, and obviously the younger we start, the better off we'll be overall in this conversation. So let's talk a little bit for a minute about what radon is. It is an inert gas, so we can't see it, smell it, taste it. And the only way to know if it's present is to test for it. Every house is going to have some level of radon, typically speaking, and it has a life expectancy of 3.8 days. So in other words, if we were able to take a container and put radon in it and came back in 3.8 days, half of that would be gone. That's kind of how it works. One of the interesting things, and the reason I mention that is sometimes we'll get feedback from the field where someone will say, well, my house has been vacant for a period of time, and that's why the radon gas is elevated. No, it has a half-life, and it's consistent, so it's pretty predictable in terms of what we'll find when we're there. And all the protocols that we're going to talk about today are based on the life expectancy of radon. So as you can see here, we have some predictable levels that we're dealing with. We show a 1.3 picocurie per liter. PCI/L, that's the measurement method for radon, 1.3 PCI/L indoors, 0.4 is our outdoor average, and 4.0 picocuries per liter is our action level as set forth by the EPA. That's a national level. So here we have Madame Curie, and Madame Curie was one of the pioneers in radiation research. In order for us to understand the depth of her work, we have to go back to the beginning, which is as radon relates to radon. Paracelsus, a fellow by the name of Paracelsus, a Swiss doctor, in 1532 discovered something called a wasting disease. They didn't know what it was, and they did some preliminary research on it, but they realized that miners were dying from some type of disease that was related to ground contact. Fast forward to 1879, a couple of German researchers were able to figure out that, well, this is radiation. And then in the 1920s and 30s, Madame Curie and her husband Pierre were able to extract radon from radiation. And that's really the modern thought process of where radon comes from. So, and that work has continued right up until the early 1970s, when the current EPA standards really started to come into focus based upon some research that was done in a miner study out in the Midwest, and also from a nuclear facility where they really were able to kind of figure out that somebody had radon in their house. And the reason they realized that was because when they went into the nuclear facility, they would always test people for radon, and they found out one individual had more radon coming into the house, or I should say better said radiation, coming into the building than when they left. So that kind of started our modern studies of radon. and is the basis for the EPA standards that we currently work with. You'll see maps like this. This one happens to be the EPA map of radon in Connecticut, but they're all over. You have all kinds of national maps, and basically they're all similar with respect to how they break down what are called radon zones. And so you'll see here radon zones 1, 2, and 3, the dark red, the orange, and the yellow. The dark red showing our highest potential for radon, which of course is the shoreline communities.
Oh, how
and then
funny it is. I'm
our
so
least
sorry.
potential level in
Yeah.
Harford County. If you wouldn't mind just
That happened to me
muting
the other time
yourself.
at the
There's a little
gym.
bit of
I'm
feedback.
on the
coming through.
treadmill and people are looking.
Thank you. So the one thing about looking at a map like this, you have to be careful with, is that looking at this map quickly, you would make an assumption that perhaps we have a low concern of radon in Harford County. That's not the case. Basically, what they're saying here is these are potentials, which isn't to say that there aren't pockets in each area where you have high levels of radon, and that's true in each of these zones. So don't be misled by a map like this, because that would be a problem for a lot of folks. So when we speak of radon, our primary concern is that of lung cancer. We look at the risk here on this graphic, and we talk about radon as being 21,000 deaths per year. These are statistical averages, folks. These are not actual numbers, but they do give us something to compare to. And we look at other forms of death in terms of drunk driving, falls, drownings, and home fires. Radon after smoking is the second leading cause of lung cancer in the United States. And it really has to do with the way radon works in what are called radon decay particles, or RDPs. Although radon is a gas, it is filled with decay particles. And it's those particles that we ingest into our lungs, and they can cause tissue damage in a building. I think we have an illustration of that coming up. So how radon will get into our buildings is basically through the soil. So any geography over which a home is built that contains any type of radiation or radon emanating stone, rock, if you will, is going to find its way into the building through any gaps or voids. So you can see in this little illustration on the right of your screen here, where they have, piping coming up through the floor, or cracks in the floor or the foundation. Those are all pathways for radon to be able to get into the structure. And of course, once it's in the building, it will off gas and create the tissue damage, as we talked about a couple of minutes ago. So when we think about radon, we have to think about the transport mechanisms, and by far air pressure is the largest way that radon moves through the building. The other considerations, as you'll see here, are emanation, diffusion, and off-gassing, which is a very small amount. We'll talk about that a little bit later in terms of radon and water. So air pressure is really where we want to focus on, because every house is going to have a pressure vacuum within the building. So as we talked about, if you look at the illustration on the right, you'll see that the radon is going to come up through the ground. But then we have all of these other pathways within the building that are affected by something called a stack effect, and also by the mechanical systems within the building and other environmental factors, which we're going to go through. So the stack effect occurs in every building, and the stack effect will be higher in a 2-story building than it would be in a 1-story building. And you'll notice in the illustration on your right that there's this little dotted line that's called the neutral pressure plane. So what that means is that there is very low pressure below that line, and as we go above that line higher into the building, the pressure will increase. So if the radon is coming through the soil, which we see represented by the blue arrows in the lower part of the illustration, it will be pushed up into the building by the stack effect. So that could be a function of systems that are in the house that create a positive air pressure within the building, or also by what are called thermal bypasses. So let's talk about the mechanical systems. So we all have mechanical systems in our house. Our HVAC systems could be just for heating or air conditioning, but we may have some exhaust systems. We could have balanced systems, or we could have exhaust only systems within the building. And of course, every type of system that we have in the house has some type of airflow associated with it. So if you look at these components that we may have within the building, whether it's a bathroom fan or a clothes dryer or vacuums or any fuel burning appliance within the building, they will all move air through the building. So what we see here represented in the right-hand side are cubic feet per minute of airflow within a building. So think about the time of year, what might be happening in your own home. Well, we use the bathroom fan on a regular basis. We probably use a clothes dryer and a vacuum on a regular basis as well. But when you get into other combustion appliances, those are seasonal situations. So wood stoves or fireplaces or our heating equipment are going to operate roughly half of the year, whereas they don't operate the other half of the year. So if you think about the normal air movement within the building of operating our first three appliances, the fans, the dryer, and the vacuum, you're looking at something in the order of 200 to 300 cubic feet per minute when these systems are operating. Well, if you add on top of that the operation of a combustion appliance, you could see where you would move a lot more air within the building. In fact, if we had a fire going in a wood fireplace, that's represented at 170 cubic feet per minute. Think about what that means inside of our homes. If we have, 2,000 square foot house with 8-foot ceilings, we have 16,000 cubic feet of air within the building. Well, if we exchange an additional 170 cubic feet per minute of that air, that represents almost a doubling of the amount of common airflow within a building because of the intermittent use of other systems within the house. So obviously, we're not going to operate wood fireplaces in the warm weather, but that helps us to understand why we would have a lot more of the airflow or stack effect in the building in the cooler seasons, as we're in right now. So in addition to that, we have other environmental factors. So last weekend, we had some pretty windy conditions. Well, that can have an effect on the radon coming into the building. So we have to think about that. And so basically trying to create some standards for purposes of a conversation here. When we talk about high winds, we're talking about sustained winds. So if you live in a part of the state on the shoreline, for example, if you are in Old Saybrook going east, historically, those are much higher wind locations than the rest of the state is. And certainly anything closer to Long Island Sound is going to be greater than that, which would be inland, for example. So we have to think of it in terms of, okay, we may have higher winds at these locations, but that may be commonplace for that area. So we have to put that into perspective. And if you think back to a few minutes ago when we talked about that radon map, and I mentioned the higher zones along the shoreline, well, this is one of the big reasons, right? You have higher winds along the shoreline, so that can be a contributing factor to the radon in the building, which is something separate from the standard geology. And then the other impact is, of course, of the weather precipitation itself. So if we have rain or snow or frozen ground, for example, what's going to happen is that's going to seal the soil. So you think about how air movement will occur through soil. Well, dry soil, it's going to move through at one rate. And if the ground is frozen or wet or snow-capped, it's going to move through at a different rate. So you can see, based upon this information and also the stack effect in cold weather environments, we can have a very different picture. The other thing to consider is the impact of barometric pressure within the building. So whenever we have storm fronts going in or going out, we're going to have a different barometric pressure. And again, this is going to be one of the factors to consider when we talk about radon. And then, so the other part of the equation are the seasonal effects, right? So we just talked about what happens with cold weather in terms of the environmental conditions, but also our houses tend to be closed up more. So when we have closed windows, we're going to trap more radon into the building because of the ventilation standard that occurs in the winter as opposed to in the warm weather. Well, if we open the windows in the warm weather, does that mean less radon enters the building? Generally, yes, but not in every case. There are some circumstances where we could actually, based upon how the windows are open in the house, which direction the wind is coming from, where we could actually pull more radon into the building. So there's some things that we need to consider there as well. But generally, good dilution of having windows open will reduce the radon concentration within the building. So those are some of the things that we need to think about. And just before we leave that subject, one of the things that we do when we test for radon is we want to have closed house conditions. Well, if you think about it, the closed house conditions will mimic the cooler weather months of the season. And the reason that we do this is that so that we can have an apples to apples comparison when we do our evaluation to figure out whether or not there's a radon issue in a building. So we want to have closed house conditions. We need to allow the house to stabilize for 12 hours prior to commencing the test. And we also need to think about our device placement. So let's talk about that. The EPA tells us in the Home Buyers and Sellers Guide to Radon, which if you haven't read this guide, it would be a really good idea to do that. You can just Google it, epa.gov radon guide, and it'll come up. And it has information in there for radon testers, radon mitigation contractors, for consumers, whether they're buyers or sellers of the home as well. So good information to have. And so one of the things that they talk about here is where we're going to do this radon test. So we're going to go to locations that are commonly used by the occupants of the home. Now, that may be different based upon one house to the next, but generally speaking, you want to test in the lowest level that could be used for living without alterations. That's the general standard that we're looking at. So with that in mind, we're looking at common locations, family rooms, exercise rooms, bedrooms, so on. And we're trying to avoid smaller or moisture prone areas. So basically you wouldn't test in a hallway, you wouldn't test in a crawl space, and we'll get into that in a little bit, or moisture producing areas like kitchens, bathrooms, or laundry rooms, for example. So one of the things that we need to think about is when we're choosing this test location is what we have in a foundation. So what we see on the left side of the screen here are the different foundation types that we may have in a building. So we have a basement, which is typically referred to as a full foundation. We have a slab on grade, which is going to be basically where the concrete floor is right in direct contact with the soil, or a crawl space, which in effect is just a short basement. That's really what it is. So we want to be able to look at these areas when we go into each house and make a determination, okay, what is the best place for us to test? Well, in an ideal world, we would test in all three. Unfortunately, we don't live in that world. So we have to think about, okay, what really should we be thinking about? So my initial thoughts go to area. So any radon testing has to consider area. Generally speaking, we want to think about a 2,000 square foot limit. So you can think about the size of a house. If we have a 1,000 square foot ranch that has a full basement, well, then the obvious location to test would be in the basement, provided that it is okay to test there. Well, how do we determine if it's okay to test there? Well, it has to be a place that someone could occupy based upon the EPA standards. So if I have laundry equipment down there, if I have a workbench down there, if I want to use it for exercise, or if I want to use it for future additional living space, that would be the logical place to do a test. What if I have a slab on grade house? Well, you're going to test wherever you are on the first floor. Whatever is in closest contact with the soil would be where you would test. And then if you had a home that's in a crawl space, well, you can't test in the crawl space, so you're going to test in the room above the crawl space. So that brings us back to, well, what if I have a variation of these? Go back to the square footage. So if I'm under the 2,000 square feet, I have a basement that maybe has a family room addition that has a crawl space underneath it, or even a slab, doesn't matter. I would probably still test in the basement at that location, because that's really the furthest below grade location within the home. But it can get complicated. It's one of the things that we have to kind of think about when we arrive on a job site. We have to kind of walk through and look at things and figure out, okay, where's really the best place for me to be able to do this testing. And so you really can't do that until you do a walkthrough on a property to figure that out. So how do we maintain closed house conditions? Well, obviously keeping the windows and doors closed are part of that. Now, does that mean we can't go in and out of the house? No, normal exit and entry is perfectly fine. There's no issue with that. We have to think about the exchange systems within the building. Do they do internal and external exchange? And is that part of the normal operation of the house? That's something that we have to consider. And then also, of course, the radon mitigation system, if present, is that something that we want to leave on or shut off? Well, we want to leave it on because the EPA gives us guidance on that and says, okay, we want the mitigation system to be on so that we can determine whether or not this system is actually working. With respect to the internal and external exchange systems, we have to determine if that is part of the normal operation of the household, and or will that affect the radon results based upon seasonal use. So if we have what's called a heat recovery ventilation system, which we'll go through in a few minutes, we would want that on because that's normal operation of the house. Whereas if we had, for example, window air conditioners, well, let me say not necessarily window air conditioners, because that one could be back or forth. Say a whole house fan. We wouldn't want to have the whole house fan on because that would be a wholesale exchange of air within the building. Okay, so that's our first section. Sue, Kara, do we have any questions?
Yes, we have two questions. One was a bit of a comment. Wow, I had no idea there were so many factors affecting radon. Is there a best time of year to do the test?
So best time of year? No. That's a difficult one to answer, because you should test whenever the opportunity to test exists. And so for purposes of our conversation, let's just say that we're dealing with a real estate transaction. The time to test in a real estate transaction is obviously before the time of purchase, because the new owner would want to know what the conditions are within the house. The EPA goes on to say that, yes, all houses should be tested at the time of a real estate transaction. They go further to say that you should retest every 2 years, and ideally you would test in a different season. And so the idea is that if you want to get a good picture of what's happening with radon in the building, you need to think about the seasonal impact of radon within the building. So you would want to do it at different times under the best case scenarios. I don't know if that answered the question or not.
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
And what if my clients want to test in the crawl space or a basement not ideal for testing? Can the sellers dispute that?
So basically, we take our direction from our client. So if our client is the person that's buying the home and they want to know the worst case scenario, we're going to have the conversation with them when we get on the job site. We're going to do our assessment and we're going to make a recommendation of where we think they should test. And so let's just play devil's advocate for a minute and say that I go into a house that was built in 1780 and there's a soil floor in the basement. There's no laundry in the basement and the ceiling height is less than 6 feet. That's not an ideal place to test because really nobody's going to occupy that space. But if somebody said, well, I want to test there because I want to know what my potential radon exposure in the building is, well, we would take our guidance from them. The EPA has 2 standards for radon testing. One is for a real estate transaction, which I just described to you. And then the other is for a general testing strategy, which really speaks to the fact that how the house is currently used. So let's just say that that seller in the building is a homeowner who just wants to know for their own information what my radon exposure in the building is. We would have a conversation with them to the extent of, okay, I see that your house is built in 1780. You have a dirt floor in the basement and it's 6 feet high. Do you spend any time in your basement? No, I never go in the basement and I'm never going to go in the basement. Okay, well then the conversation is very simple. We're going to test on the first floor, the lowest livable level suitable at that point in time. Okay.
Thanks, Bill. I have one more question here. The counties in the southern part of the state along the coast are more likely to have higher levels of radon because of the higher winds and more extreme weather? Question mark.
So they're not more likely to, there's a greater potential to, which is different. And so what they're saying based upon the information that they have, they believe that there's a greater potential. The problem with the EPA maps is nationally, not just in Connecticut, is that they're really based upon data from the late 80s. And so we haven't had any updates to any of those maps since I believe the mid 90s. It might have been 96 was the most current one. And obviously we know a lot more about radon than we did 25 years ago. So again, I wouldn't paint that photo picture with a broad brush and say that one is going to be higher than the other, because as I mentioned, each of those counties have pockets that are very high. The lowest potential, as we saw on that map, was in Harford County, and we've gotten readings well north of 50 picocuries per liter in several areas of Harford County. So you almost have to look at that and say, okay, well, there's a higher potential there, but if I want to know what my radon exposure is, I actually have to test my house, and that's really the answer. Okay.
Great. Thank you so much. We can move on.
Great. Okay. So a few years ago, there was a little bit of a brouhaha about granite countertops and their potential for radon. So if we think back to our 8th grade science, might have been 7th grade, I don't recall, it's been a while. We talked about igneous rocks. I think there was sedimentary, metamorphic, and igneous rocks. Well, igneous rocks are the ones that have greater potential to have radiation emanating from them, which of course is in our case radon. And so the idea is that any of these rocks have the potential to contain uranium or any form of radiation derivation. And so some of them may have some contributing factors. The problem is that you really would have to isolate the actual slab of granite to be able to test it. And that could be done. There's no practical way to do it, but if you think about it logically, we could put a monitor on top of that slab of granite. We could isolate that monitor. I've done it in my own house, just using a storage container and taping it down to the countertop and leaving it there for a few days and then see what the levels are. I did that. We have a large slab of granite in our kitchen. And it was interesting to me that it was actually emanating less radiation than our fireplace was. So you never really know what the sources are. The idea is that you test the whole house, and then you'll have a better picture of what potential you may have in the building. Okay, so how do we do that? Well, we have EPA testing methods that we have to follow, and we have these devices that we're going to be able to use. So if you look at the upper left corner of these photos, you'll see these charcoal testing devices that are what are called open or closed diffusers. And so they all look a little bit different because they have different features of them and different exposure rates. And the important thing in using these charcoal devices is that you have to make sure that you understand what the limitations of each of those are. So for example, if you have an open face system, the exposure period may only be 2 to 3 days. Well, what happens if I leave it for 7 days? You're going to get the wrong answer. So you have to make sure you follow those. And that's really I guess the concern about using this type of equipment is that if we don't follow the rules, then we may not really know what our exposure is going to be on there. We also have something called an alpha track device. This is typically for longer term testing, so not related to a real estate transaction necessarily. Generally, you're going to use an alpha track because you want to get a better handle over the seasons, just like we just talked about, of what my radon exposure is over the period of time. So an alpha track device would be something that we would use between typically 91 days and a year. On the lower right, you have what's called an EPERM, electric ion chamber, which works off a little bit different technology than the charcoal. These are voltage based systems, and these could be short-term or long-term. And then finally, we have the continuous monitor, which for real estate transactions really is what you'd want to use because it gives us information. The problem with the charcoal devices, the alpha track, and even the EPERMs is they don't give us information. We don't have the ability to really understand what was happening during the period of time that that device was deployed. Whereas with a continuous monitor, we get regular readings. And matter of fact, you're getting multiple readings per hour out of these devices. They're also collecting information with respect to the temperature, the barometric pressure, the humidity in the building, and virtually all of them have proximity sensors for tamper-proof applications. So we can get a lot more information. It helps in the diagnostic part of what's going on to ensure that we got a good test. And also will tell us if anything happened. So was there a power outage? Did somebody knock over the monitor? Was the monitor moved? Those types of things. So a lot more information, and therefore that's the type of device that is preferred. It's also the type of device that we use. One of the important things when you're using these continuous monitors or active monitors is that the individual that's deploying and retrieving this device actually understands what they're doing. They are fairly sophisticated computers. And so it's important that there's some level of training that occurs. And that's what we call the NRPP is for. The National Radon Proficiency Program is a program that certifies radon testers and mitigation contractors to ensure their competency in deploying this equipment and therefore giving reliable results to clients. So real important to have that. The duration of the test, as we just talked about, typically short-term test, 2 to 3 days is common. It could be up to 90 days, and then longer-term tests, as I mentioned, 91 days to a year. We do need to notify people when we're in the building. So typically you'll have some type of a door hanger on the buildings to remind people to maintain the closed house conditions during the test period. It's important that we all understand what our roles are in this process and making sure that clients are receiving factual information. You know, every once in a while you hear these tales that are out there of, you know, what's happening in a building. One of my favorite ones is, somebody will say, well, if there's spider webs in the building, you don't have any radon. I'm not sure that spiders have lungs or are susceptible to lung cancer, but that's just not true. So we should all just stick to the facts. We should know what it is that what we're doing and not doing. And we should communicate well in terms of making sure that everybody understands what closed house condition means in the building, what they should or should not be doing near the devices, and also what would be the exposure period for that particular test. And then there should be a plan to say, you know, how are we going to get back in the building? We've deployed this device. We need to be able to get back in to get access so that we can retrieve the device and be able to offer the test results. So we all have a role to play, whether we're a tester, whether we're the seller's agent, whether we're the buyer's agent. We should all understand what our role is in this conversation. Whoops, I clicked one too many. So we make an assumption that there's some radon levels in the house that do need to be mitigated. Therefore, we would encourage the client and direct the client to contact a mitigation company. And so basically, they're going to put in a system. And what we're seeing here on the left is a mitigation system that was installed after the home was built. We know that because the piping is on the outside of the building, as is the fan unit. And then on the right-hand side, another option for that would be to run the piping inside the building. And whereas in this case, you don't see the exhaust fan on the outside of the building, it's up in the attic. And we'll see some new construction photos or illustrations in a second as it relates to that. So down in the basement, in this house, or whether it's new construction or existing construction, we're going to have some piping that's going to come out of the floor. So you can see this 4-inch PVC pipe that basically they just cut a hole in the floor. They put the piping in there, and then they attach the fan assembly to it. And then down in the basement, you'll see this little U-tube device, which is called a manometer. And a manometer basically tells us what the vacuum pressure is in the building. So that blue liquid, which is what you're seeing in there, has a little scale associated with it, and that's representing inches of water column. Now, I've heard people tell me from time to time that that's the radon level in the building. It is not. That basically just tells us that there's a vacuum present. So if you see one of these systems in a basement and you see that the liquid levels, in this case, they're blue, but sometimes they're red, are offset, that tells you that there's a vacuum present. That's all it's telling you. It doesn't tell you how much radon's in the building. The only way to know that, again, is retesting. In fact, if you could see what the little sticker next to this says, it says that you should retest every 2 years, and that's the EPA protocol. You can see that we have some cost information down here with respect to the cost of these systems. And then on the right-hand side, you'll see just some different versions of the fans. You notice on the lower right, there are 2 fan units there. That was a very large house that had actually several piping systems within the building. So depending upon the size of the building, it could be different versions of that. And I mentioned earlier about a heat recovery ventilation system. Sometimes you'll refer to these as energy recovery ventilation systems. It's really the same concept, where basically we have this box, whether it's down in the basement, sometimes they're attached to a furnace unit itself. And then there'll be some vent piping that's going into the building and some vent piping going out of the building. If you look at the inside of one of these things, you're going to see that there's a heat exchanger in there. And so what's happening here basically is this system is operating via control, and there could be any number of types of controls associated with this. It could be a timer that's on there. It could be tied into a forced air furnace system in the house so that it runs when the furnace is running. It could be based on a humidistat where the humidity levels in the house will dictate when it operates. But they're all going to do the same thing. There's a blower, 2 blower systems within here, and one is pushing air out of the building and the other is bringing air in the building, and it passes over a heat exchanger, which is this block that you see in the center here. There will be filter assemblies associated with that. And so the idea is we're pulling air from outside the building, it's passing over the heat exchanger, and simultaneously air from inside the building is passing through the heat exchanger. It's giving off the energy to the incoming path of air, so that reduces our energy penalty on the system, and exchanging stale air inside the house with fresh air from outside the building. And that's how they work. They're very simple and very effective. They work on a little bit different principle, whereas the sub-slab mitigation systems, which are the ones with the fans that we looked at earlier, are basically creating a vacuum below the floor and discharging the radon gas out of the building via the vent piping, as opposed to the HRV or ERV system, which is diluting the air within the building. So we see here a radon resistant new construction, and notice that there's no fan associated with this in this illustration. Basically, we have below the floor our radon gas coming up into the T-fitting of the piping, and then the piping going right up through the building and exiting the roof, just like a plumbing vent stack would be coming right up through the roofing. And so the idea is that if we install this type of system in new construction and we do have a radon issue, which you would only know by testing, that you could very simply just add a fan. So notice up in the attic area, they have a junction box up there, which is a requirement of this new construction standard. And so basically the installer could just go up into the attic, cut the pipe, install their fan, plug it in, and now the radon system is active on there. This is a standard that's required currently in the state of Connecticut. It's based upon the IRC standards called Appendix F. So all new construction in the state of Connecticut is required to be radon resistant new construction now. Okay. So with respect to new construction, there's no way to know what could be happening in that building until it's built. So the standard recognizes that, and that's one of the reasons why we have Appendix F now, because otherwise it's just kind of a guessing game. And so there could be different versions of this installation. You're looking at the left side here, a crawl space where it looks like they had a dirt floor in there. So then they just put the polyethylene sheeting down and then put the piping in, and again, just make it active, as opposed to the other standard, which we looked at earlier, which has a concrete floor in the basement. So that completes this section of our presentation. Do we have any questions, Kara?
We do. Is the nuclear power plant in Niantic an increased reason in radon on the shoreline?
No.
Okay. Can you not assume that a mitigation system is keeping levels safe just because it is running in a home?
Yeah, you can't. We're working on mechanical systems here, right? So everything has a life expectancy. Radon fans, which is really the only moving part in the building, has a life expectancy. So that fan will wear out, the bearings will wear. It will create a different relative vacuum in there, and that could change the conditions. One of our environmental staff the other day called me up and said, Bill, I'm in this house and I can hear this sloshing sound inside the radon pipe. Well, what was happening was the water level below the building wasn't being managed properly. So the radon intake below the floor was actually underwater. And so that's going to affect how that system operates. And so the idea is that house needed to have a sump system installed so that they could pull the water level below the floor down to allow the radon system to operate. So yeah, there could be a variety of different factors that can come into play on there. Yeah.
So just to follow up, my question is then, I would assume your recommendation is even if a client is purchasing us a home and there's a mitigation system in place, they do a test to make sure it's functioning properly?
Absolutely. Yep. Yeah. Anytime anybody is buying a house, I know this sounds self-serving, folks, but the EPA is telling you that you should be doing radon testing to know what's happening in that building. Whether there's a mitigation system there or not is really not even the point. You want to make sure that the family that's moving into that house is being protected. That's really the bottom line.
Great. Thank you.
Great. Okay, so that's the radon air part of the conversation. And then I mentioned to you, if you remember about 45 minutes ago, we talked about the type of transport mechanisms. Well, one of them is diffusion, right? So radon and water is brought into our house through the diffusion process. So the source is going to be similar, right? Not the same, but similar. Because we have a lot of bedrock in Connecticut. So we tend to have radon in our water as well as in our air. And so the difference being that our wells tend to be a lot deeper than the ground source for the air in the building. So if we have a 200 or 300 foot deep well, we can have a lot more exposure to bedrock and therefore radon in the building. And which is not to say that the radon in water is the major contributor of radon in air, because it's not, but it can be a contributing factor. And that's the important part that we need to understand. So as we mentioned earlier, we're in a house, in this case, you open up a water valve and the radon is being diffused into the air, and then we're ingesting that into our lungs. So think about what happens in normal household activities. When you're showering, for example, you can be in a closed environment and get a very large dose of radon in a relatively short period of time. And you can see here, when we talk about the relative exposure, there are levels of more than 1 million picocuries per liter that have been found. We do have very high levels of radon in water in the Northeast. And the average, as you see here in Connecticut, private well has about 3,000 picocuries per liter. Now, there is no EPA standard for radon in water, but what the Connecticut Department of Public Health has done is created a guideline. And what they've said here is that if you have 5,000 picocuries per liter in water of your well water, then you should mitigate. And of course, this is a different type of mitigation system than you would have for air in the house. And again, this is a guideline, but it is a well-defined guideline for us to follow. So when we think about this, they go on to say, meaning the DPH, that you should do 2 radon tests before you make a determination as to whether or not you should put in a mitigation system. Well, obviously that's not practical in a real estate transaction, because they tell us that those samples should be taken 3 months apart. Can't do that. So what they've gone on to do is said, okay, we're going to make an accommodation, which, by the way, any short-term testing, whether it's for air or water, is an accommodation. You should do 2 samples at once. So when we do a radon and water sample, we will take 2 samples at the same time. And then the way that they reconcile that is there needs to be agreement of those samples. So if there's more than 15% difference between the 2, the laboratory will kick it back and say that, listen, we need to retest this because the sampling protocol was incorrect. And there is a specific protocol that needs to be followed. So with respect to mitigation at low levels, and they're showing here between 10 and 15,000 picocuries per liter, we can use a granular activated carbon filter system, which is what you're seeing on the right-hand side, those 2 tall cylinders there. And they're very effective. Basically, the water is just going to be drawn through the carbon on there. The carbon will absorb the gamma rays, which is what does damage in radon to lung tissue. And basically that will extract about 80% of the radon from the water. So we have our cost estimates on here, and they do go on to say that these should be maintained annually. The maintenance for these carbon filters is basically they just swap out the canisters. They'll disconnect these canisters from the piping system, bring new ones in, and then off you go. But that should be done annually, by the way. That's actually pretty important to follow up on that, because if you don't swap them out annually, what could happen is the charcoal can only hold so much of the radon in there. And if you just leave it and ignore it, it will release it right back into your water source, into your building. So if we have higher levels of radon in the air, then we're going to be talking about some type of an aeration system. And there are different ones on here. This aeration system, as they state here, removes a high level of the amount of radon in air, up to 99%. And this does require maintenance as well. If you think about it, this is an open system. That pipe that's coming out of the top of this box, if you will, which is basically a box full of water, is open to the atmosphere. So if we can get radon gas out of the water, then that means things can come in through there. So think about yard debris and pests and that kind of stuff. So you notice the top of this has these clips on it. That's because it needs to be disassembled annually and cleaned. So that mitigation system, the black box, is just basically filled with water. The pump on the front of it, that gray squatty looking pump on there, is basically just going to inject air into the water. And then that white pipe will just let the air take the radon right out of the building with it. On the right-hand side, that green tank that you're seeing there is basically a booster tank to bump up the pressure for that, because you're going to have obviously pressure loss associated with this. So with respect to radon, really, the only way to know what's going on in the building is to test, right? We know that these levels can change over a period of time. They're not consistent. They change all the time, in fact. And therefore, the recommendation is to do retesting every 2 years. As I just mentioned, the dual vial water sample is required for the radon and water. And of course, there is no safe level of radon. So when we talk about professional standards, it's important to understand that we are following a set of standards for the radon, which we've just described to you. As inspectors, we're also required to follow a set of standards, which are the licensing standards for the state of Connecticut. So we have standards and practices that we need to follow on there. And of course, as a responsible business, you want to make sure that you're doing the proper training, that you are maintaining licenses properly, that you have a professional standard with regard to insurance. It's very important that you understand that there is no insurance requirement in the state of Connecticut for home inspection companies. So you want to make sure that you align yourself with a professional organization that has a full service staff and that has any of the required credentials for whatever type of service that they're providing. So one of the things that you'll receive today as attending this seminar is a flyer here that helps clients understand what's going on, whether it's a buyer client or a seller client. This is something that you may want to relay to people so that they understand what's happening. And also we have links to our website on there, which has additional information for you to follow up on. As you can see here, my name is Bill Rourke. Kara Golden is our Director of Marketing, and Sue Fasciani, our Marketing Manager. We're all here to help you in any way that we can. Kara, did we have any final questions?
I don't have any final questions, but I would like to share with you all our raffle winner today. And our raffle winner today is Gail Mercy. So congratulations, Gail. I will drop that off at your office for you. I'll connect with you beforehand. If you want to just flip back to the final slide there, and Sue.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for attending today. And I just want to again mention to you might have the coupons that we have out there for $25, but right now make sure you share that promotion Tiger 30 because you'll get your clients $30 off and also 30 off of their radon test. And please, follow us on Instagram, like us on Facebook, and we have more videos on YouTube, so you can always find us there. If there's no other questions, again, thank you so much, and we hope to see you all next week.